Travels of the Ellis Arbor is an audio narrative set in the world of Bastion using 5e compatible characters. A dark fantasy world with chaos, intrigue, magic, and mystery. The story, setting, and sounds are written by Lonomy and published by lonomy.creative. Tune in for episode 12, Justice. And so, on a cold, late morning, amidst the waves of Var Elamora within their new, decrepit surroundings, the crew of the Ellis Arbor treated with the Knights of the Callowheart Sanctuary. As he had done for the last week, Nout had fashioned a simple breakfast from the non-perishable supplies at his disposal. Tins of food, roughly baked bread from a day before, and a stale cup of coffee were mustered to greet their new, unexpected guests. As they met within the large chamber, a setting of sorts, strewed about the main hall, Edward hustled down to greet them, all the while slinging his rifle over his shoulder and removing his goggles. The knights looked curiously at Ed, teetering down from a vantage point, and turned back toward the captain. In his intrepid wisdom, he shook off their look of vague distrust with that same poignant charisma.
Edward likes to hunt for seagulls in the morning. He takes his gun with him to the roof for a little target practice. Think nothing of it, my friends. Coffee?
Pouring a deep, hot cup of rich, grainy coffee, the crew and the knights gathered to make the most of their lacking feast. As it had been alluded to, Adeline, the banshee that plagued this chapel, had been a thorn in the Callowheart's side for nearly a decade. One brisk, wet season evening, a group of sailors ran aground after being assailed by a pod of sirens. One of their number, a particularly green sailor, took pity upon the wounded siren, taking them in under the cover of darkness and stowing her away in their below decks as they made for land. As their crippled vessel limped toward the landing, the siren took her savior for her own, before slipping away in a violent, amorous display. Merely months later, the siren returned to the land, basking in the sun brazenly upon the rocks, and eventually she was welcomed by the people who live on the waterfront, a kind of strange, crude gift of charity. Though it would not be long before her wicked curses would infect the area that she stood upon. Despite her love of the people that took her in, she warped the cathedral into a place of madness. People began to drift into the ocean and drowned. Others began to turn to madness, tearing at their own flesh and causing havoc for the surrounding neighborhood. It was said that this siren had a gift of necromancy and would cast her wicked magic to bring back every soul that was ever lost to the curse's madness. Despite this, the people that she rose became shallow vessels of their former selves, taking on more of her own aether than she had intended. And so, when there were no longer sailors left alive that she could play with, she became the tower's caretaker. She brought others into her home, hoping to save them from the very curses that she birthed. That was, until our courageous and curious crew brought her low. And so over their shared meal, the knights handed them a sack of gold, enough to make their way throughout the outer townships, and invited them to the Callowheart Sanctuary. There, they would meet with the heads of their order and discuss how to go about clearing their names with the city guard. And so, hurriedly finishing their crude breakfast and collecting what they required, the crew of the Ellis Arbor assigned their new knightly companions made for the Callowheart Sanctuary within the southwestern quarter of the briny ward. And though flanked by their esteemed and powerful allies, the crew could not shake the stares of fishermen and militia that watched their ascent. As they trod through the cobblestone and pavement, their surroundings began to change from the decrepit, sea-worn outskirts toward the high street where stone was met with polished glass and wood-laid storefronts. Turning westward, they crossed into a busy street, prominently displayed as Vertali vendors. A lane filled with all manner of artisan and sundry business, busily going about trade on a cold, far-reach morning. And as they continued, the stairs became more and more apparent. Boring into their silhouettes, they took particular interest in their more beastly companions, Nout, and the infernal Carpathian. And as they strode, the streets became littered with more and more hurried tradesmen and customers, pushing through the tidy lanes of storefronts and wagons. To their right and left, the buildings began to arise to a second and third floor, giving rise to a more affluent or commercial district. And behind some of the more industrious shopfronts rose taverns and hotels, their upper floors reserved for the more wealthy individuals to look down upon those that could only afford the stone. And amidst this bustle of commerce, wealth, rush, and ramshackle, Darian and his crew continued onward. That was until an errant sound made the captain whip toward one of the more impressive high-rise taverns toward his left. As the sound began to whistle past his ear, he turned to see an errant crossbow bolt flying only a few feet from where the crew made their path, and jamming into the cobblestones in front of them. A black-fletched bolt stuck firm and halting their path. Turning toward the origin of its trajectory, he could now see a group of 4 figures leering down toward where the crew were marching. Each human leaned over the rail in a kind of menacing, foreboding presence, their knuckles white-hot and braced upon the railing, and a glimmer of armor beneath overcoats and jackets. Though they were in plain clothes and clearly off-duty, Darian recognized the men as members of the guard that had chased them toward Adeline's sanctuary. And staring back, Darian carefully rested his hand upon his own pistol. At this sudden, disturbing occurrence, the knights gathered the crew closer, pressing them onward and insisting they ignore the stares of these pitiable folk. And so the crew pressed on, all the while summoning looks and glances, while keeping a close eye on the rooftops for any more crossbows or violent threats. And after nearly an hour of travel, winding up the stone streets and pushing past all manner of interested individual, they came upon their destination. Standing high in the morning air, alight with all manner of reflective metal detailing and with regal blue flags swinging gently in a faint breeze. The Callowheart Sanctum, in its magnificent, pious glory, stood in contrast to its commercial and worldly surroundings. Meeting with the heralds at the door, their companions bid them enter, keeping a watch on the door as one by one they stepped off the pressing commercial streets. The halls of the sanctum were very reminiscent of the chapel they had spent their last weekend, though much more refined and still full of its pious luster. Guards and knights lined the corridors, about their business in whatever means the crew could dream up. There appeared to be religious practitioners meeting ceremoniously within its halls. Scholars wandered through some of the halls, clearly about their research, and all the while, Darian and the crew began to drink in the rich tapestry that was the sanctum. Meladrin, as it turned out, were a prominent people throughout the Briny Ward. Here within this and other churches, they continued about their practices, clearly fascinated with their religious beliefs and quite proud of their heritage from within the depths. Though there was scarce time to enjoy their tour, as the crew were met with one of the leaders of the chapel, a sea elf and a cardinal. In turn, the group were handed a folded letter, a welcome sight that they had not hoped for. Unbeknownst to them, the crew had done a mighty service for the Meladrin of the Callowheart, and were gifted a right of lodging. As the tavern master had told them, this was all they were required to find lodging within any hotel of the Briny Ward or nearby commons. Together with the gold that they had acquired for the slaying of Adeline, this would go a long way to securing a point of rest. Though, as their thankful exchange occurred, a rapping of feet against stone and the echoing rumble of the cathedral door swinging open began to fill the corridors of the sanctum. There, standing with crossbows and hooks at the ready, a gang of 4 quite ravenous-looking men lurked within the antechamber, their weapons drawn, and their grimaces could only be described as twisted and filthy.
Where are those pirates? That scum made a mockery of us. If you're hiding them from ourselves, make no mistake, we will tear this place apart until you hand them over. Now, make it quick before we start making a mess.
Travels of the Ellis Arbor is made possible by the generous support of our subscribers, followers, and most notably, our patrons. Thanks to Rob Jenkin, Nathan Ebley, Ensign Turtle, and Alex von Hostrit for supporting us so far on this journey. Please subscribe, give a like or a comment, follow us on Twitter, and stay tuned for the next episode. Don't forget, take care of each other.